Steven Spielberg is considered by most to be one of the greatest directors of all time, and very deservingly so at that. He learned or took inspiration from many of the greats that came before him, and has directed several of what are considered among the best movies ever made. But in addition to everything else that makes him such a great director, there is one other reason why I believe many regard him as having made so many great movies over his career, and it's not one that's discussed too often. And today, I'd like to go over this aspect of Steven Spielberg in more detail. Specifically, what is it about him that makes audiences love him so much? And please do note that there will be major spoilers for a bunch of his movies ahead. So in case there's something of his that you haven't seen yet but plan to, you might just want to proceed with caution. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay. So let me just start out by saying, I'm not a film expert. I couldn't go over all of the technical aspects of filmmaking that Steven Spielberg has mastered. And the same goes for the way he writes his movies. Unfortunately, I am not a writing expert either. But the thing is, there are many other people out there who are experts on these subjects and have most definitely given him his due credit in these areas. And what I want to discuss is an aspect to his success that isn't brought up nearly as often, which is that unlike most other great filmmakers out there, he always appears to be on the same page as the audience and actively tries to make his movies for them rather than in spite of them. To put it another way, when you look at many of the best writers and directors throughout film history, most of them had to fight the studios tooth and nail to be able to tell their stories the way they wanted to. And even then, more often than not, either the studios would still interfere in order to appeal to the audience, or changes would be made at the behest of test audiences. And for just one example of that, Orson Welles was famously plagued with this problem throughout his entire career, with very few movies he made after Citizen Kane turning out the way he wanted them to. Now, a major reason directors often have this problem is because the way they want their story to go, and the way the audience wants that story to go, or at least some of the time, the way the studio thinks the audience wants it to go, contradict each other. Now, who is right and wrong in these situations is irrelevant to this video, as the only valid point here is that great directors often don't want to tell stories that general audiences want to see, which can sometimes, I repeat, sometimes lead to friction between them. But Steven Spielberg never had this problem. He always seemed to know exactly what the audience would want out of a given movie, and was not only willing to give it to them, but sometimes even fought for it to be that way, in complete contrast to many other directors. What I'm trying to say is, unlike most others, Steven Spielberg seemed to be in sync with the audience, and that his vision for his stories and what audiences wanted to see from them actually lined up, as opposed to many other great directors. Like, for example, Spielberg's chief criticism as a director is that he can be too sentimental. But right or wrong, the truth is simply that general audiences do tend to like sentimentality in their stories, especially the kinds that Steven Spielberg tended to tell. And as I got into in my video on whether or not too much sentiment is a bad thing, which you can find a link in the description to, in some of his movies, such as Schindler's List, Spielberg is able to use his sentimental nature to make the story even more impactful by not looking at it from a nihilistic or hard reality standpoint, and instead through the eyes of how a normal person would see it. It makes the audience all the more likely to feel the total tragedy of what's going on without it feeling like they're being manipulated. Because Spielberg understands how to get the story across to them. And even in cases not nearly as extreme, his sentimental nature just allows the characters to have moments of humanity that they otherwise probably wouldn't have, which makes the audience connect with them better. And not to mention, his sentiment really hits home when he's doing something targeted at younger audiences, as kids tend to love sentimentality, and he knows how to do it right. But even aside from his sentimental nature, there are many individual examples of him making decisions in his movies in part for the audience, and more often than not, he usually turned out to be right in those decisions. And for just a few examples of that, he famously fought for the shark to finally be killed in Jaws by having Brody shoot the air tank in his mouth, even though the author himself told him it wasn't realistic. But Spielberg simply replied that the audience would believe it because they'd be so entranced in the story, and he wanted to give them an epic finale. And in the end, he was right. To this day, people are still surprised to learn that scuba tanks won't blow up if shot. And going back to the sentimental thing for a second, he felt the characters in the book were way too unlikable and went out of his way to make sure in the movie that the audience would sympathize with them and want to see them succeed over the shark. And not only was that another thing he was right about as far as the audience went, but even most critics agreed and heavily praised him for that. Or later on, Spielberg was very hesitant about making Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom so dark, which was the chief complaint many had towards it at the time of its release. Or similarly, he also was very unsure about Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, but went along with it anyway, mostly out of loyalty to George Lucas, who had written the script. My point is, in both these instances, Steven Spielberg's intuitions were right on the money as far as audience, and even critical, reception went. And had he made rewrites to the scripts, the audience probably would have taken to them better. Or mirroring Jaws, when it came time to shoot the climax of Jurassic Park, two different endings were written in which the raptors were killed differently, with both involving either one or both being crushed by the dinosaur skeleton. But Spielberg felt that the T-Rex was the true star of the movie, and that the audience would want to see it one last time. So he rewrote the ending to have it be the one to kill the raptors and save them at the last second. Again, if you really think about it, it doesn't make a ton of sense, but it also doesn't matter because audiences found it to be one of the most epic endings in film history. And as I touched on before, the irony here is that in this case, it was Steven Spielberg revising it to suit his vision and the audience loving it, in a complete reverse of how stuff like this often goes. Because as I already said, usually the ending is revised against the director's wishes to make the audience happy. And this also applies to movies he didn't even direct as well. And for just one example of that, when George Lucas screened the original Star Wars movie for his fellow peers, which was mostly comprised of young writers and directors, everybody hated it and said it would flop. All except Spielberg. He was the only one who said that it would be a huge hit. And sure enough, when adjusted for inflation, Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope is still the second highest grossing movie of all time. So if anything, Spielberg was understating it. But the point is, that right there proves he knew something about general audiences that most other great movie directors don't. Or for another example of that, originally at the end of Gremlins, after Gizmo pulls up the shade to kill Stripe, Billy was supposed to pull up another shade to ensure that he would die from sun exposure. In other words, it was pretty much just supposed to be Gizmo who gives Billy the idea of how to stop him, and he would then do it himself. But Spielberg, who was serving as executive producer, told them to change it so that it was just Gizmo who opened the shade, as he felt the audience would grow to like him and would want to see him save the day. And smartly, the director decided to go with that. And screenings from test audiences only further proved Spielberg's point, because they did in fact want to see Gizmo be the one to kill Stripe. And even earlier in production, when the studio complained that the titular Gremlins were being shown too much, Spielberg was easily able to get them to back off before it ever reached anybody else. And not to mention, Gizmo was actually Spielberg's idea in the first place. Originally, Gizmo was supposed to turn into Stripe and become the leader of the Gremlins, but Spielberg insisted on having one of them stay good and cute. And in the end, the movie's director, Joe Dante, attributed that decision to being what made the movie so popular. And when Dante wanted to keep Kate's story about her father in the movie despite studio objections, Spielberg let him, despite not caring for it himself, because he felt it was Dante's movie and respected his choice. Or for a third example, because Spielberg's company was a partial producer on Who Framed Roger Rabbit, he was the one who was able to get permission from other studios to use their cartoon characters in the movie. Because let's just say, if Disney alone had tried handling that, it never would have happened. And even beyond that, Spielberg also fought for specific characters to make an appearance, and specifically the Roadrunner and Coyote. Because they were created in 1949 and the movie takes place in 1947, the animators were hesitant to put them in, and Spielberg argued that continuity didn't really matter in a case like that, which he is right about if one takes into account that the Toons are treated like actors who need to be discovered, and that the audience would want to see them because they're so iconic. So at his urging, they were put in the final scene where all the Toons look at the remains of Judge Doom. And though they don't do much, many will admit that they do appreciate their inclusion nonetheless. Now, obviously, there are plenty of other examples of this that I could talk about, but I think I've already made my point. That Steven Spielberg just seemed to have a knack for understanding what the audience would want to see in a movie, and furthermore actively wanted to give it to them. And I really do think that was a major reason for his appeal as a director. The fact that his vision and what the audience wanted seemed to almost always coincide with each other. Now, obviously, Spielberg is far from the only director in film history with that distinction, but he may just be the most successful among them. And, of course, at the end of the day, the majority of the credit behind his success does belong to his natural abilities and talents as a director and writer. I won't even try and deny that. My only point was that I do believe that his ability to understand the audience and fight for what they wanted when many other directors of his kind would fight for their vision first and foremost, and somewhat rightfully at that, but that's not what we're discussing here, may be an understated reason why his movies were so successful and beloved with the general public. Alright, I think that's everything I wanted to cover. So now I'd like you to tell me, do you believe that one of the reasons for Steven Spielberg's widespread success as a director was because of his ability to understand what audiences wanted, or do you believe that had nothing to do with it at all? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And please note that you do not have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video if you don't want to. You can feel any way about Steven Spielberg and his movies that you want to, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.